Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm delighted you could be with us this evening. I'm Susan Edwards, Executive Director and CEO at the Frist Center. We're privileged to have Dr. Maxwell Anderson here this evening to speak on the modern challenges of ancient art. Our co-sponsors for this evening's program are Vanderbilt University's Department of the History of Art and the Department of Classical and Mediterranean Studies. Dr. Anderson's talk is presented in conjunction with Rome, City and Empire, which is on view in the Ingram Gallery until May 28th. The exhibition includes over 200 works on loan from the British Museum. This is our first collaboration with the British Museum, and we want to take a moment to thank our sponsors for their very generous support for Rome, City and Empire. Platinum sponsor, the HCA Foundation, on behalf of HCA, TriStar Health. Hospitality sponsor is Union Station Hotel, and we thank all of the 2018 Frist Gala patrons. The exhibition is indemnified by the Federal Council on the Arts and the Humanities, and we gratefully acknowledge the generosity of the Metro Nashville Arts Commission, the Tennessee Arts Commission, and the National Endowment for the Arts. We have two very special guests with us this evening. It's my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Armando Varricchio, Ambassador of Italy to the United States, and his lovely wife. Formerly stationed in Belgrade, Ambassador Varricchio presented his credentials as the Ambassador of Italy to Washington in March 2016. In 1985, the ambassador graduated from the University of Padua, summa cum laude, with a degree in international relations. He entered the Foreign Service the following year and was promoted to ambassador in 2014. Ambassador Varricchio's previous post included diplomatic advisor and G7 G20 Sherpa for the Italian Prime Minister, Deputy Secretary General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Minister Plenipotentiary, diplomatic advisor to the Italian President. In 2017, Ambassador Varricchio was decorated Knight of the Grand Cross of the Order of Merit of the Italian Republic. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Varricchio.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us here today. And I'm so delighted together with my spouse to be here. And thank you, Susan, for your very kind introduction, and to Mark Scala for the fascinating tour he gave of the exhibit. When I received this invitation, I was asking myself the reason why the ambassador of Italy was invited to introduce such an important event. Today, you will have a very, very thoughtful talk about ancient Rome and ancient history. Rome, of course, not just the capital city of my country, Italy, but it's more than that. In its very name, the Eternal City, gives us the idea that what had happened in the past, throughout a very, very long time, hundreds of years, was not just an accident in history, but it gave us a legacy that we are so proud to inherit, and we have to pass on to our children. Today, I had a chance to have a tour of this great exhibition here in Nashville, Tennessee, about the city and empire. This exhibition offers us an interesting diversity of objects from across the vast empire that provide invaluable insight both into the imperial government and, equally as importantly, into the lives and experiences of different people who rule, both citizens and also foreigners that were all linked by their participation in this huge experiment. Both of these are extremely interesting because they tell us about a civilization which has long gone but which never ceases to fascinate us. And we cannot understand one without the other. And being myself a citizen of Rome, I was born in Venice, another old city, and I would like also to talk about Venice, but then moved to Rome, and I've been living many years in Rome. It's just a daily experience, because whenever you walk around, you walk the city, you are surrounded by the past, you're surrounded by this great remains of what is a great civilization. But also, they speak to us every single day. Because ancient Rome is closely connected to our modern days. Archaeological evidence of Roman presence is scattered extensively throughout Europe and that beautiful part of the world, which is the Mediterranean, the Middle Sea, the sea connecting different worlds, different cultures, different religions, telling us what Italy still is, a country stuck in this beautiful part of the world, surrounded by what is different from ourselves, but also very much connected to ourselves. So it is a daily experiment, a daily struggle, try to cope with diversity, preserving our identity, which is so important today, but at the same time being open to understand what is different, because there is a cross-fertilization. This was the case 2,000 years ago, is still true these days. The link between ancient Rome and the modern world transcends these geographical borders and spills over into other areas where its influence is undoubtedly even stronger in the creation of legal systems all over the world, the development of democratic practices, infrastructure, urban planning, and of course, architecture, and in the way we think and talk of philosophy, literature, and the arts. It is also interesting to think of how Romans lived in what we could define a globalized world. Today we speak about globalization, pretending that we have invented globalization. But make no mistake, in that era, that was a globalization. The world, as we know those days, was very much interactive, and there were no borders. People used to travel around, culture used to spread, goods were traded. So in a way, the old Roman saying that all roads lead to Rome, they could also turn elsewhere and the other way around, because the roads also were leading elsewhere. Rome was connected to the world. Rome was at the center of a very, very globalized world. And again, this is the reason why, thinking about history and thinking about the past give us thoughtful thoughts every single day today. Because ancient Rome was, after all, the biggest conurbation in the West before the 19th century, and faced many issues similar to ones we deal with today. Therefore, it continues to be a source of identity, learning, and inspiration for present and future generations, as we can see by the many enthusiastic visitors of this beautiful exhibition, and is certainly a key part of our DNA. Ancient Rome is our history, but it's also part of our common cultural heritage that today faces growing threats from war, terrorism, climate change, and even simply oblivion. Italy is at the forefront in protecting archaeological and cultural heritage around the world and boasts an excellent collaboration with the United States in this field. It is important to cherish our past. It is important to keep the memory, to keep the legacy, because we want to connect the dots. Protecting our heritage is making us better. Protecting our heritage tells us that we have to be proud citizens of our present times, trying to preserve what we bring on our shoulder, but at the same time being able to cope with the future challenges. And exhibits such as Rome, City, and the Empire are a key component of the system that protects our common cultural heritage. Dr. Anderson will expand on these topics in his very thoughtful lecture. His contributions to the world of art were recognized by the President of the Republic of Italy already in 1990, when he was decorated with a very important honor of the Order of Merit of the Italian Republic. He's a true expert on Roman art, and I sincerely look forward to his lecture, which I know will be enlightening. But before I conclude, Since I'm very fortunate today to be visiting the great state of Tennessee, I want to express my warm thanks to the people of the state of Tennessee for the kind welcome and hospitality, and renew my appreciation to Susan for inviting me to view this exhibition so finely showcased in the first center. Again, I think that I cannot conclude my remarks by using a very, very well-known Roman dictum. We learn from history, because history is our daily teacher. This is true in Rome. This was true 2,000 years. This is also true in Nashville, Tennessee today. So thank you very much and enjoy the lecture.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. You can see all that charm and diplomacy there, right? Now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Maxwell Anderson is Consulting Scholar, Mediterranean Section, University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, and President of Souls Grown Deep Foundation. He graduated from Dartmouth College with highest distinction in art history before earning master's and doctoral degrees in the history of art from Harvard University. Dr. Anderson's background in the field of antiquities includes 7 years as curator in the Department of Greek and Roman Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and almost 30 years as a museum director. His publications include the monograph Pompeian Frescoes in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and dozens of articles, along with 2 books, The Quality Instinct, Seeing Art Through a Museum Director's Eyes, and Antiquities, What Everyone Needs to Know. As we just learned, Dr. Anderson was decorated Knight Commander in the Order of Merit of the Italian Republic in 1990, and in 2010 he was named a Chevalier in the Order of Arts and Letters by the French government. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Maxwell Anderson.
Thank you so much, Susan. I so appreciate the invitation to be here tonight. And Ambasciatore Vericchio, mille grazie anche per le sue parole, per la sua presenza. So tonight, although we're talking about the subject of ancient Rome, I'm going to try to make it very current, because I think part of what's essential that comes out of the exhibition next door is that we're presented with artifacts that go back 2,000 years or so, and yet we leave the show, come back, and walk outside into Nashville, and perhaps the issue of what this show means to us in daily life isn't obvious. So I want to take you through some of the roiling issues that are consuming museums, governments, the press, people around the world that touch on the art of antiquity. And part of that definition of what matters has to start with vocabulary, because there's a lot of verbiage to be used by people in the field of ancient art and archaeology, and yet not all of it is transparent. I would start with the word antiquities, because antiquities includes 2 categories of things. One is archaeological materials, things excavated, and the other is ancient art, things about which we know very little in terms of where they were excavated. So part and parcel of that is thinking about when objects are in front of us, whether in this exhibition or elsewhere, are they antiquities from a field excavation or an underwater dig, or perhaps are they simply arriving from the art market? Different countries define antiquities differently, because it's the past, and therefore everybody has a slightly different past. In China, the definition of an antiquity is anything before 1912. For the United States, it's anything that's 250 years old. So the versions of reality that go around the globe are altogether different, and it is incumbent on people who are involved in this field to understand every single country's interpretation of laws, statutes, export restrictions, and treaties. Scholars around the world define antiquity differently as well. There are disagreements about when the ancient world stopped in India or in Mexico. You might say that Christopher Columbus's arrival precipitated the end of antiquity and the beginning of a modern age. So 1492. Other scholars would say no, there had to be a gestation period of 50 years or more. So within the legal structures of countries around the world, there are disagreements about when antiquity stops and what we might call the Middle Ages start. And then there's the phrases we use very loosely: countries, nations, state parties. A country is basically an old-fashioned way of saying people who live somewhere and they're from that land, very inchoate land. A nation-state is a phrase used often in describing in the 19th century a people who are from a particular race or ethnicity. The Germans spoke of die Völker, the people, the German people. And a state party is a country that signs a treaty, that's party to a treaty. So these things actually aren't all the same. One of the things interesting in the exhibition next door is how all these objects came into the British Museum's collections over its 250-year history. After all, the Roman Empire spanned, as we heard from the ambassador, across the world, and from North Africa to Egypt itself, across to what we today call the Central Asian world, up to Europe and around to Britain, Britannia. But in fact, the ways these artifacts moved was basically distilled into two categories: things that were stolen or things that were traded. Because when conquering armies arrived, it was one thing to keep a few keepsakes and objects. You may have seen The Monuments Men in that film, and you understand a bit about how even in the Second World War, soldiers around the world brought back a few things after the war, many of which have been returned since. And such was the case throughout antiquity. People would bring booty and take back from warfare objects of great importance, and they would end up somewhere very far away, or they were traded, and those are the two primary means by which things made their way from one place to another. Which leads governments to ask, when does an object need to stay where it is? When does it have repose? Repose is a legal term, meaning when has it been there long enough that nobody has a possible claim to it? And that's a big argument, which is not easily answered nation by nation or in fact, in international treaties. And it's not something that can be solved very easily. We'll talk a bit about that later. Governments and regimes change all the time, and sometimes they have different interpretations of what antiquities where they need to be as a function of that. In the case of some modern Islamic governments who suppressed the evidence of their pre-Islamic past, remarkable changes have happened. Things have been put to the side. Now in Saudi Arabia, there's a sudden new interest under the new crown prince to review the heritage of Saudi Arabia from before Muhammad. And so there's a renaissance of interest in different parts of the Arab world in the ancient past, much as we see in other parts of the world a desire to create a sense of the contextual framework of a current government belonging to antiquity. And broadly speaking, we'll talk about this as well, about when a modern nation says it owns an ancient culture. If you look at a map of the world today, you see these very nice boundaries the United Nations has defined for us. They certainly don't overlap perfectly with the ways that the ancient world worked. So you take the Ottoman Empire in the course of the late Middle Ages through the 19th century. It occupies today modern-day Turkey, but it spanned a whole variety of other today modern nations. And so the Turkish government lays claim to things that are within the Ottoman Empire, but it doesn't necessarily have a connection to modern Turkish realities. So these are part of the challenges that we face in studying antiquities and understanding where they belong, where they came from, and where ultimately we can work as a people internationally to see justice done. So there are really two big points of view about ancient art and antiquities, and there are the views of people who collect it in the modern times, museum people, dealers, private collectors, and then the archaeological community. And these two people see the world in completely different ways. And I think they both have legitimacy. So I've tried in this book that Susan mentioned to tease out some of the ways in which a rapprochement between these two conflicting points of views might be arrived at, difficult as it is. But broadly speaking, archaeologists value the extrinsic quality of an object. What is that object from? How did it function in a particular site or context? What evidentiary trail does it take us back to in terms of the life of the person buried in a tomb? All of those things, those batches of information, are what interest archaeologists. The object itself is like a piece in a puzzle. By itself, it's just a piece in a puzzle. But as the puzzle is assembled, we get the full picture, or a reasonably full picture, of what it functioned as in a larger domestic, religious, cult context, political context. So that's the archaeologist's point of view. The collector, museum person, the dealer, their view is, hey, this is a beautiful object. I can see its value and virtue intrinsically, not extrinsically. I can see what it represents, what's the subject on it, where it came from broadly because I know other works that are like it. And so it has an existence and a value independent of where it was found. So those 2 points of view are in conflict. They can't coexist neatly, because an archaeologist would say your interpretation of the object is compromised because you actually don't know where it's from. And the art historian would say, you guys are playing too much on the theme of where it was found in a tomb. Who cares? It had a life before the tomb. Do you know about that? You don't, because it was in the tomb when you found it. So this debate is actually at the core of a much larger struggle around the world about how antiquities are making their way through the market into collections, museums, and galleries. The debate is changing because of a variety of changes in law. And we'll touch on that in a bit, but I think the other point to keep in mind is that the perspective of all of this begins with the question, who's responsible for protecting this heritage? If Egypt isn't adequately policing royal tombs of the pharaohs, are they actually simply turning a blind eye to looting by local residents in Egypt who are facing poverty and difficulty, and for whom finding objects and selling them are really their only way to make a living? So there's a question in the United States and our government about this, in which we insist, if we're going to sign a bilateral accord with a state party overseas, that they're actually doing something to protect their heritage. Otherwise, how can we be working to prevent those objects from coming into this country if the country of export isn't, in fact, protecting its heritage? So what's happening now with the antiquities market is a very large shift in the last, say, 15 years. And the shift is that objects that do not have a history that goes back a certain period of time are proving to be very hard to sell. Their prices are low because nobody wants to buy them. Because if you buy an object which lacks a history, a known history, before the state party's date of authorization for export, you're exposing yourself today to legal risk in a way that you weren't in the past. Now, objects that have a nice history that takes you back decades are reaching astronomical prices because they don't command with them the likelihood, at least, or the possibility of seizure. So there's an image of a cosmopolitan drink. I've never had one, but I think that's what they look like, at least according to Google Images. And the name cosmopolitan in the cosmopolitan argument about the ancient world isn't about the drink, but it might as well be, because it makes you a little dizzy. It is about when is it that an object actually is part of a country versus part of humanity. Someone who adopts the cosmopolitan point of view, which is one that's universal, that says, art is for humanity, let it be free. Why should people in one country lay claim to antiquities that happen to be from the soil that they currently live on in a modern state? Kind of like that situation with the Turks and the Ottoman Empire. There's no necessary connection between an ancient Greek and a modern Greek. A modern Greek lives in democracy of the present. An ancient Greek might have lived in Illyria or Sparta or a different, in effect, country within the ancient world that had no correlation to what we today call the Republic of Greece. So a cosmopolitan argument says, given that, why should these laws be in place at all? They're just laws to protect art and heritage on behalf of a country, when in fact, this art should be allowed to be acquired anywhere by any museum anywhere in the world. And the argument's interesting because it lays claim to the idea that art is for all humanity, and that the desires on the part of foreign governments to retrieve objects that left their soil, ended up in museums or private collections, is really an act of unfounded aggression without a legal basis. There's one problem with the argument, which is that, in fact, international courts recognize that a nation can declare nationalized property, as most countries in the world do. Most countries in the world say the oil under their country belongs to their country, unless they've explicitly privatized it. In our country, it's the reverse. We actually have to claim things as federal land. Otherwise, let the buyer do what they do. The same is true with our objects of art. When the Founding Fathers came around to say, let's create this country and we're going to have all these plans and formulate a basis for our democracy, they didn't think about art or history or heritage. Why? We didn't have any. We were brand new. So in 1776, the idea that the U.S. would have laws protecting American heritage was ridiculous. We were a month old. So over time, we've become an outlier nation. We're perhaps the only nation on earth that doesn't have laws restricting the sale and export of American heritage. Now just think about that. If George Washington's bed from Mount Vernon was on eBay, the only question that somebody in the federal government would ask was, boy, I wonder how much that's going to go for. Whereas if you were an Italian or an Algerian or a Brazilian, you'd say, stop the sale, that's cultural heritage that belongs to our country, our patrimony. We don't have that in our DNA. We're the outlier, we're the exception. And you might argue that that makes a lot of sense because, in fact, as a country of immigrants, we're a country that has brought to this world all sorts of experiences and heritage from around the globe, and we should be as equally porous in seeing works from our country go around the world as well. And that's basically the way it works with one notable exception, which is Native American material. We signed an agreement in Washington decades ago, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA. And what NAGPRA says is that any Indian band or tribe can lay claim to objects in a public collection or a private collection and say, actually, that is my heritage. And the US government will get involved and see to it that those objects are restituted to that tradition. So that's the only example in our country. Otherwise, again, George Washington's bed, fine. Sell it on eBay, it can end up anywhere in the world. So this argument, this cosmopolitan argument, as I say, has one big flaw, which is that 99% of the countries on earth disagree with it and say, no, we actually have the right to declare what we own. And we should always be mindful, we're an exceptional country. I'm not saying we are exceptionalist, I'm just saying we're really exceptional. One of the bigger challenges in studying ancient art and looking at the antiquities next door and understanding objects that don't have a scientific context is making sure they're not a fake. You wouldn't believe how many fakes there are in major American museums today. I don't know personally. I do know that in the pre-Columbian world, there is an enormous number of forgery objects in collections. Why? Because forgers can be very canny, intelligent people. And they can work in concert with tomb robbers. So one of the oldest tricks in the book in Peru is for forgers to make a series of pots, decorative scheme that's beautiful, that's colorful, that draws off of another tradition like moche pottery in Peru in the first millennium AD. And then they go in the middle of the night and bury them in a legal excavation. The next morning, archaeologist arrives and starts digging and says, oh my God, look at this amazing vase. Isn't this extraordinary? Never seen anything like it. Yeah, well, there's a reason for that, but he doesn't know that, or she doesn't know that. And then suddenly, the forger has an amazing opportunity to sell fakes based on the same discovery made by an archaeologist in their formal scientific trench. So this is in the playbook of forgery. And understanding forgeries used to be a matter of an intelligent art historian walking in and sniffing something and looking at it sideways and saying, it's not right, meaning it's a fake. But scientific evaluation has now evolved to the point where you actually have tools that are fairly helpful in a variety of media, such as in ceramics, certainly in bronzes and cast metals, less so in stone, because stone is a pretty unforgiving medium that doesn't give up a lot of secrets. But with terracotta, for example, with clay, there's a test called thermoluminescence, which allows you to take a microscopic measurement of the heat of a baked clay object made 1,000 years ago and be able to identify its date plus or minus 250 years. And the reason is that on a very small atomic level, that object is still cooling off, believe it or not, from the day it was put in a kiln 1,000 years ago. Now, it can't be measured with a thermometer, but it can be measured with thermoluminescence. So forgers have learned one good thing to do is to take bits of ancient terracotta and put them in and among objects of modern making and try to deceive the investigation. The piece that you can see in the background of this slide is a statue. If you've seen it, you'll recognize it in the J. Paul Getty Museum in Malibu, California. It's the Kouros of the Getty. It was a $7 million purchase many years ago. And the label on it today says late 7th, early 6th, or late 6th century BC, around 510 BC, or a modern forgery. Because the Getty in the 1980s was the wealthiest museum on earth, as it is today, and it was buying very actively works of art that had in their heritage Greece, Italy, Turkey, North Africa. And there were a lot of forgers who were very happy to make works for the Getty. They knew they didn't have a portrait of Claudius or Caligula, so they would make to order forgeries that the Getty would happily buy without realizing it. And most of those are now in storage, and they can be seen in storage, but not on display. The Kouros is one exception who remains on view as a huge question mark. But it also raises the point, if you don't know if something was scientifically excavated and studied in a way that affirms its antiquity, you could be getting a raw deal. Within the field, you could say that forgery is the most extreme example. But then there are other versions of what an object might be less authentic without being a forgery. Maybe it's restored heavily. Next door in the exhibition, you can see some sculptures that were cleaned up and restored after the British Museum acquired them in the 19th century. And that's to be expected. And then you can go all the way to a situation in which, if you go to the Vatican museums, where I was a couple of weeks ago, in the Hall of the Animals, it's this riot of sculptures of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. And there are these fantastic images of dogs and cats and all sorts of creatures who were revered in the Roman world. But they're all restored in the 18th century, many of them by an artist named Cavaceppi, who turned them into something else. And they're glorious objects, but they're not ancient, nor are they 18th century. They're kind of in the middle. They're a pastiche. So one of the things you discover when you study ancient art, since it's been knocking around for a couple thousand years, is it gets other people's hands on it. And you need to make sure as you examine it, how much of this is authentic? How much has been touched by human hands in the aftermath of its discovery? So the law, returning to that, raises lots of questions that haven't yet been settled, surprisingly enough, all these years after people got interested in antiquities. And it all began actually to be rationalized in the 1960s. In the 1960s, most of you are too young to remember, there were a whole series of liberation movements around the world, particularly in Africa and South and Latin America, where people were throwing off different governments, they seem all to be coming back right now, which were autocratic and or tied to a colonial past. So many of the countries in Africa, in Asia, in South Latin America were colonies of Spain, of Britain, of so many other nations, the Netherlands. And as they achieved independence, they found an appreciation of their past. And they began to create property laws throughout the world in the 1960s and 70s. In November of 1970, in November 17th, 1970, in Paris, UNESCO brought together over 150 countries to deliberate on signing a convention that would basically say, all right, that's it. We need to stop the absolutely untethered circulation of antiquities, of objects that have no clear background. We have to clamp down on this. So the year 1970 became a watershed as nation after nation signed up to join the UNESCO convention. The most recent one I know of was Ghana in 2016. All these years later, countries are still joining. There are now over 130 signatories, I think. But what did the UNESCO convention actually achieve? All it did, in fact, was to say, we need to stop this, okay, stake in the ground, and you guys all need to make inventories of objects in your museums, in your monuments, in your cultural heritage, so that if they do get stolen, people can say, oh, I know where that's from. And you also need to set up bilateral agreements. You need to set up treaties among countries so that trade doesn't continue to occur without regulation. So in the US, we have a series of agreements, 15 in total, out of all the countries in the world. My daughter tells me there's over 140 countries, I think, and we have 15 of them have signed up with us. And we have agreements with them, including Italy, including Greece and China and Cyprus, that say, you can't actually bring antiquities into the United States from this country unless you can prove they predate that country's date of export law, very often in the 1970s or 80s. And so we have this now in place, and when you come through customs at the airport, if you're coming directly from overseas, the ICE officers are supposed to know if you're bringing back a tourist thing or an antiquity. Now, I don't know how you train I don't know how you train people to do that, I swear. I have enough trouble identifying a fake from a real thing. It's hard for me to imagine that a very beleaguered federal officer who's trying to help, there's squealing babies, there's all sorts of distraction, and then he's looking at a thing and saying, now, is this a Mayan relic or is it a replica? But that's what we're looking at now. That's how we're controlling the illegal import of antiquities from Latin and South America, from Europe, from Asia, is it's down to that particular person who has to figure that out, which is a very tough assignment. So international treaties haven't proven themselves to be fantastic. After all, we only have 15 countries with whom we have these agreements. And so surprising countries like Turkey, we don't have an agreement with them to prevent the import of Turkish material from antiquity. So it gets then into the courts, which is a very exciting place to be. With the courts, a state party like Turkey can and has successfully sued museums in this country for the restitution, the return of antiquities. In 1993, the Metropolitan Museum of Art was forced to return over 120 objects of extraordinary importance to Turkey because evidence was shown that they had been illicitly dug up years earlier, decades earlier, in the 1960s. And so the question of a statute of limitations is also not necessarily very helpful if there's evidence of looting. As a result, foreign countries have two choices. They can sign this MOU with the State Department and join the other 15 countries, or they can just get a lawyer in a state Supreme Court and take that museum to task. It's faster, it's easier, and in some respects it also brings the public awareness in, and so that's the route that different countries have pursued. And it's very disorienting if you're trying to help this situation, because you know that one of those two departments, the Department of State or the Department of Justice, is going to handle the situation. So the tug of war around antiquities in our country is no less complicated than it is in all of these other countries. Then there are national laws as opposed to these treaties, and national laws are very complicated. Within a specific nation, a source country so-called, or a country filled with antiquities, they might have had a lot of laws over time. Turkey, for example, there's a law from 1906, a law from 1983. They have different laws with overlapping language. And then the US has to decide, well, are we going to be enforcing their law to prevent the import of an object? Or are we just going to say, unless you can prove it's stolen, it can come in the US, which is basically what's in place for the other non-15 signatory countries. So it's a Wild West situation around protecting cultural heritage in our country. And it comes down to closing your mouth, basically. I think I'll invoke the name Bill Cosby without any editorial comment other than say, he said, if you're dieting and you've tried this diet and the low carb and the low fat, the last option is close your mouth. So in this instance, the last option is for people not to buy things if they're offered in the United States because they don't know. And it reminds me of a car. I mean, most of us wouldn't willingly buy a car without asking the question, oh, by the way, is this car stolen? Just wanted to check on that. Whereas with works of art, you actually don't ask that question if you don't want to. You just say, well, do you have a bill of sale? Will you say that you own this work of art? And yes, okay, I'm good. And that's how auction houses work. Christie's and Sotheby's who who sell millions of dollars of objects a month, in their disclaimer at the front of the book, it says, we will stand behind the authenticity of every object we sell. But they explicitly say, but we won't actually stand behind whether the person selling it owns it. Kind of a problem. So when we have in our country this porous appreciation of the free market, which we had until earlier today, which I gather is now shutting down. I haven't quite followed it. But when we had a free market, the premise was that goods could trade, services could trade freely across borders. And that included antiquities and works of art. So the restrictions of market nations when they're trying to prevent export is more complicated if the US is not a willing partner to say, we're going to play along with you. The only way we do that, again, is if they sign up with this treaty with the State Department. Modern nations is also an interesting construct. What is a modern nation? The Dutch were really among the first people in the world to say, hey, we're a nation. We are a people, we have a common language, we have these borders, we've got this amazing navy, we've got problems with water, but we're a nation. And the concept of nationhood, therefore, is actually fairly recent. It's a few hundred years old. Before that, in antiquity, there were various forms of racial discrimination. We're Germans, we are from Germania, or we're Romans, we are, and it wasn't until the Emperor Caracalla, who's next door, in the year 212, when he said, you know what, I've got a great idea to raise some more money from taxes. Let's make everybody living in the Roman Empire a citizen. And then we can get all this new tax money, which ultimately led to people saying, no thanks, I don't want to pay taxes. And it led to gradually contributed to the disintegration of the Roman Empire. So the question around who's in a country, are they really a citizen? Do they have the right to own something? Can they sell something? Is still a very fraught question in a lot of countries around what is a legitimate claim of state ownership. Because you can own in Italy antiquities in your house. You can purchase them from a gallery in Rome or in Milan, put them in your house, but you can't sell them outside of Italy. So that's from a belief in the patrimonio, the belief in the patrimony and heritage of the Italian Republic. That's how it works there. So looting is something a lot of people think about, and Indiana Jones got us all thinking about that afresh, about the excitement of breaking into tombs and finding shiny things, which archaeologists hate because, of course, they're not interested in the shiny things. They're interested in the boring things that have inscriptions and therefore maybe a date or the reference to a human being who could be tied back to the site and context. And Indiana Jones did us no favors in leading to the premise that the excitement of archaeology is finding precious things. That is not the point of archaeology. The point is to understand where and how people lived in the ancient world. So looting is a big problem, but so are chance finds. What's a chance find? The World Bank spends billions of dollars a year in Afghanistan, all over the world, giving grants to build roads, bridges, dams, aqueducts, whatever they're building. And guess what happens when you're going to build one of those things? You're going to find some antiquities. I mean, there is no question about it. So what happens to those antiquities? Imagine this. You're a foreman on a job building a house in Lebanon. And you do the demo and grubbing, and you discover, oh my God, there's a statue here. Looks pretty good. But if I report this to the local gendarmerie, let alone to the local museum director, my permit for construction and excavation is going to be yanked. And I'm not getting one thin dime back. And that permit could be yanked for years. So there is simply no incentive for a chance find to be reported. How much of the world is being strip mined to build roads and bridges? And a lot. And a lot in archaeologically rich contexts. And we know nothing about these works because one of two things happens to them. They're either put on the black market, spirited away at night, so they're not attached to that place of excavation, construction, demolition, or they're destroyed. So that represents an unknowable amount of material. Someone asked me earlier today, is there anything left to find? Yes, almost everything is left to find. Most of modern life is on top of the ancient world. It's not like we've been digging everywhere to find things under our homes. How about underwater? UNESCO estimates that there are 3 million shipwrecks around the world. It's an estimate based on seafaring beginning in the Bronze Age and the second millennium BC, and every year a bunch of ships went down. You do the math, 3 million ships. What's on the ships? Well, a lot of them are boring oil jars and wine jars and, things like that are for commerce and trade. And then there's the looted stuff. Looted in the 1st century BC by Gnaeus Pompeius, looting Greek sites, bringing back statues. Pliny the Elder wrote this book in the 1st century called Naturalis Historiae, the history, natural history. And he said that there were life-size gold statues, silver statues in Athens. Where are those? Well, some of them are next door because they were melted down to make other little things as time went on. But where's that stuff? a lot of it is under the water. A lot of it, gold doesn't deteriorate in seawater, or doesn't deteriorate badly. So a lot of the shipwrecks around the world are filled with extraordinary treasures. And the technology of underwater excavation, marine archaeology, is very primitive. The only people doing it now are people who are doing it for profit, which is not a great idea. I hope none of you is here, because here's the problem. They want to find coins. There's a shipwreck from Spain that was a wreck in the 17th century off the coast of Colombia, just a few years ago. Billions of dollars of gold found on the shipwreck. There's a court case between the Republic of Spain, the monarchy of Spain, I should say, and the Colombian government, and the guys who found the stuff, the profiteering company, the for-profit company. All three of them are in a tug of war saying, well, whose stuff is this? And there is really, in the high seas, very little to go on. There was a UNESCO convention put forward a few years ago about marine discoveries, and it hasn't been passed by enough countries to matter. But just think about that 3 million shipwrecks for a minute. And to me, that technologically is the most exciting arena in the field of archaeology to come. So things ending up on the market, how do they happen? So if they're illegal, they end up because somebody found that chance object, spirited it out overnight, fenced it, got it to a buddy, put it on a truck, went under a bunch of melons, crossed the border from Italy into Switzerland, went into a gallery. The gallerist in the old days would read the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, the newspaper, read the obituary pages, ring up a widow and say, I'm so sorry for your loss, Mrs. Gesteltmüller. Would you be interested in having some benefit to go forward to help you in your time of need? Well, what does that mean? Well, if you sign this affidavit that with your husband's passing, you're now ready to sell his collection of antiquities. That was a ruse very popular in the 80s. The Swiss have cracked down in 2003. They put in place a new law. But people are very clever when it comes to subsidizing and moving around illicit material. And one of the challenges that with ISIS destruction of Palmyra, there are two fantastic relief sculptures of Palmyra in the exhibition next door, we've seen also this wanton destruction intentionally for ideological reasons of the ancient world. We saw that with the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan, blown up by the Taliban. This happens routinely in the destruction of a pre-Islamic culture or a culture that preceded whatever nation is involved in its current care and feeding. And this is a problem that will continue over time. It's happened in Asia as well. The Khmer Rouge was detonating works in Cambodia. This is a picture of a storeroom in an unmentioned museum in Europe. Because let's say new antiquities are found tomorrow in a site near that museum. Do you think the museum director and curators are overjoyed? They've already got no room at the inn here. There's nowhere to put these works. They don't have time to photograph, measure, restore. They have no opportunity to do research and scholarship. So they're frustrated by new discoveries of any scale. And that leads one to ask the question, well, shouldn't there be a legal market? A lot of museum people would love to see a legal market. Now, such a thing exists in Japan, in Great Britain, and in Israel, where you can buy antiquities legally in those three countries. And in Britain, the curator installing the show here was sharing his challenges with the Treasure Act in Great Britain, which was passed a few years ago. The Treasure Act said, you know what, if you find an antiquity in Great Britain, turn it in, we'll pay you something. A week later, everybody was buying metal detectors. And you could say, okay, that's great, they're finding coins, they're finding helmets, and they were, but they're also, yanking things out of the ground willy-nilly to look for treasure. They're not disappearing, but it's a challenge for everybody to keep up. So that's one solution which has pluses and minuses. Simply making it illegal doesn't work too well because there's more illicit digging today than there's ever been. In Syria, of course, during the hostilities, the challenges there are so much poverty, so much unrest. What is a 10-year-old kid going to do? His parents say, go out in the field and find some things. What else is there to do in a country which has been ravaged by war, where there is no opportunity? And so we're not providing, as a world, the antidote to these incentives. We don't have a mechanism in place to prevent them. Documentation is very challenging because a lot of objects are very similar, and if you put them on a shelf without paying much attention, suddenly you go, oh, wait a minute, where was this one from? So the documentation of artifacts is an extremely important ingredient in all of this and must be carefully measured. But again, for these very busy archaeologists, these museum professionals from Afghanistan to Lima, Peru, they don't have time, they don't have resources, they don't have graduate students who are ready to deploy as we do here in Nashville. Replication very often is something that leads to confusion. People who are Hellenists, who study Greek art, used to say, well, Roman art is just a bunch of copies. Well, next door, there's a whole bunch of copies, quote unquote, when they're actually originals. And so the language of ancient art and archaeology around replication is very important. Some works were replicated because they were made of molds in terracotta or glass molds, and that doesn't make them less important. But it's something to keep in mind as we study these objects, is that on occasion we can learn a great deal about the methods of replication, what they can teach us today about how people lived and worked and made objects in antiquity. 3D printers raise an interesting question. A lot of people want to own ancient art. Well, what if we make stuff that is so compellingly similar to the original? The human eye is only so good, particularly when you get to my age. Can you make a convincing replica of something that doesn't look like it was bought out of a museum shop, but looks like it really comes out of the ground? Yes, of course. Will that perhaps offer an antidote to illicit digging? Will it at least help slow it? It's an interesting challenge. I just have a few more slides and we'll take a few questions before we wrap up. So, restitution, retention, repatriation are all words that have to do with how you might argue one way or the other that something is stolen and needs to go back, or something is from a place and probably deserves to go back, or what the heck, let's send it back. There are all sorts of gradients of when objects from the ancient world found in one country end up in another. Objects in limbo are objects which arrived in America, for example, in the 1980s, after a lot of these export laws were passed in Mediterranean countries, and so technically they're not legally here according to the United States. Museums won't acquire them because they would violate their strictures. And so these objects cannot actually end up in museums, and there are tens of thousands of them in the United States. So enlarging the legal market is something that a lot of people talk about, but actually there's one massive country that's thinking about it, and that's India. It's a startling development, completely unexpected. A couple of years ago, the Modi government came into power. The new Minister of Culture said, you know what? Other countries are doing, let's do this. Let's have a legal market of Indian antiquities. Well, it's not really that simple, because you come back to the questions that we've already touched on of forgeries. You come back to the question of people who are digging for speculation in order to feed that market, destroying sites to make things available for sale. You have a whole raft of people coming forward who had been hiding in the underground with stolen material before, who are now prepared to sell it. Are they incentivizing and creating a bigger market? So legalizing the market, much as the conversation in our country about legalizing drugs, is a very challenging, fascinating, complicated one which cannot be solved in the near term. One of the things I think about a lot is how do you move past ownership to stewardship? How do you think perhaps about not owning things, but having them on long-term loan? Borrowing them for a decade, restoring them, putting them together. I mean, we have such impatience in our culture. If you've got a statue here in Nashville for 10 years, you might be ready for the next one in 10 years. In the old days, it was an assumption, well, unless the object is permanently in a collection, it's not really valuable. I completely disagree, and I think we could make room for stewardship as an alternative to ownership. So these are the last 10 questions, and I'm hoping we'll bring the lights up and you'll have one or two before we close in 5 minutes. Are claims likely to increase in coming years? Are countries likely to come after owners? Yes, I'm confident of that. What new technologies might safeguard antiquities? There's a guy who is using dogs to sniff out stolen antiquities by creating an aroma in an archaeological site And the dog would say, yep, this is from Palmyra, there's no doubt about it. And it's an amazing, scientifically accurate and rigorous formula. How about remote sensing? Remote sensing has completely changed archaeology. The satellite images of sites, as we've been watching Syria and its degradation through bombing and looting, it's been heartbreaking, but it's also allowed archaeologists to map very carefully the changes that have happened. Underground, yes, a third of Pompeii has never been touched. Underwater excavation, I think, is an enormous frontier going forward. Are source nations going to be better at policing their sites? Well, they have a lot of other competing needs. A country as big as Turkey, how do you police what is basically a single archaeological site? It's nearly impossible, but that's where remote sensing comes in. And I think the other question, Amelia, around distractions. Here we are, we're talking about this, you came to see this exhibition, you tolerated my remarks tonight, but do people care about antiquity anymore? Or is it just something that's in the way, like that construction project where finding a statue is an aggravation, it's a problem? Are we also glued to our mobile devices and to the present world that the past matters less to us? I'd like to think, because I've devoted my life to this world, I'd like to think that the more things become virtual, the more we become interested in our collective human heritage. I'd like to think that. And with that, any questions? Thank you. We have a roving microphone. Megan has a mic. She's going to be available for the first hand that goes up, and if you don't, I'm going to call on you. Oh, okay. There we go.
Talk to us about the Parthenon marbles.
So I'm going to see the Parthenon tomorrow morning, thanks to the Frist, and I'm going to look for some marbles. I don't know if I'll see any, but I will. That comes to the question of repose, which I mentioned. The Parthenon marbles, or the Elgin marbles, discovered in the early 19th century in the sense of discovered in Great Britain as objects that Lord Elgin had purchased. He purchased them from the Ottoman Empire. He didn't purchase them from the Greek government because the Greek government never existed at the time, which is part of why it's a complicated situation. And the other is he had a bill of sale. A firman, it was called in Turkish. Legal document. So you have this taught question. So what the Greeks said is, you know what, we're just going to build a museum for these marbles on the Acropolis, call it the Acropolis Museum, and we're ready. Because one of the arguments that the British Museum had in the 19th and early 20th century was, well, these third world people could never take care of antiquities. Now, state-of-the-art museum raises the question. I happen to believe in repose. I think the Mona Lisa should stay in Paris instead of going back to Italy. I think that the Metropolitan Museum should hang on to its Cypriot material, the Berlin Museum to the Ishtar Gate. I think these things should stay because they've been there for hundreds of years, or at least dozens and dozens. I think the problem for us now is what do we do to protect heritage today? Just one man's opinion. Yes?
Yes, Dr. Alexander, I'd like to thank you for being with us, and we certainly enjoyed the information. The question I had was, and I was thinking back to that slide that you showed of the museum storeroom that was bursting with artifacts. Of course, we know this has been going on for decades and decades. But wouldn't you say that's a positive argument for knowledgeable collectors who want to maintain the provenance of an artifact?
Right, so that is why the legal market is still an actual question, why the Indian government has raised it, is storerooms are bursting. New things are coming out, there's no room for, can't we possibly share this? I think there's an argument to be made for that. On the other hand, I think we should remember that storerooms are like library stacks. You don't look at a library in Nashville and say, how many books are in circulation right now? I mean, we don't know. Do we define the importance of the library based on how many books are checked out at any given moment? No. Same with an art collection in a museum. It's there for study. Scholars come and they research 20 different examples of the same frickin' terracotta pot because they're fascinated by it, and it gives them all the information they could possibly want. Whereas if you start sending those around the world to private collections, in Latin it's called disjecta membra, or bits and pieces shoved everywhere. So I'm not confident that there's a rationale for that of the past finds, maybe with future finds. Susan, I'm watching you because I know people have grumbling stomachs and other priorities. So how many more questions?
Anyone else? Over here? Oh.
5 minutes. 2 minutes.
Thank you for your lovely lecture.
Thanks.
It's very appreciated. How do you feel about deaccessioning?
I'm very emotional about deaccessioning, so I'm going to start blubbering. So deaccessioning is when a museum sells stuff off. Here's the thing. In 1992, the Association of Art Museum Directors, of which Susan is a member, made a deal with the Financial Accounting Standards Board in Connecticut. And the deal was this. Museums no longer had to count objects in their collections as capitalized assets on their balance sheet, which means they no longer had to chase down the value of every single object in their museum. Great relief to museums. But the other side of the deal was they couldn't sell them for any purpose other than buying art. Because if you monetize the art, it belongs back on the balance sheet. If you keep it as an asset which is not capitalized and it's non-performing, then you have the right to sell it in order to buy another work of art. That was the deal we cut in 1992. If we change now and start selling things willy-nilly, we're going to lose that deal, and museums around the country will be non-compliant. They'll have qualified audits, and they will be held to pay. So that's one simple answer to a very complicated question.
Anyone else? Oh,
The last question of the evening.
Thank you so much for your study and your passion about what you do.
Thank you.
My father was a monuments man in World War II and a sculptor, and I didn't actually realize enough about what he did until after he died. What concerns me, and I think it's an ongoing in the world that we live, is how do we protect all these antiquities from us? I mean, from military action, and what responsibility can our country take to say that we will not destroy other people's culture?
Thank you for that. Thank you very much for that. Also, that tale of your family. In 2002, I wrote a letter to the Wall Street Journal urging the Pentagon, which hadn't yet invaded Iraq, to be careful about monuments and museums. And I said, if you are going to invade, please have a plan to avoid bombing tumuli, ancient tombs, and make sure museums aren't looted. And so I got a letter. I sent this off to the Journal about 2 weeks after it came out. The Pentagon called and said, can you come down and talk about this? So I went with a phalanx of scholars. I was not an Iraqi scholar. I brought a professor from the University of Chicago who was. And we sat with them for hours, and he went into the E-ring and helped try to prevent destruction. Even with the best laid plans, literally best laid plans, it fell apart, as you know. The museum was looted in Baghdad. Our Secretary of Defense at the time said, hey, things happen. And in times of strife, in times of conflict, it's extremely difficult to prioritize cultural heritage. But like the monuments men, there are some people in the field of battle who will do that. At the very upper echelon of the Pentagon, I thought we had their attention. But as things devolved, we didn't. And I think this is just part of the collateral damage of war, that it's very difficult to prioritize that in a matter of conflict. And I would like to imagine that would change, and I would like to imagine our country could be a leader in that. I'm not deeply optimistic about that, but particularly today. But I think going forward, there's a chance for that if the values and concerns that we collectively share about human heritage can become part of education, life experience, through travel, learning, and a collective vision of our humanity. Thank you so much for tonight. Really appreciate it.